Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We're an unusual organisation. We are a UK-based certified social enterprise with a mission to try to drive up the levels of conduct and integrity, transparency, truthfulness, and trustworthiness in the financial services sector. When I say that to people, most people say, gosh, you must be very busy. And my goodness, we really are. We're UK based, as I mentioned, but we have members in 21 countries around the world. We're very, very pleased to have a rather unusual international perspective on the topics that are of interest to us. The Transparency Task Force has this agenda for reform. We want to drive positive, progressive, and purposeful reform of the financial industry. We are not in any way, shape, or form enemies of the sector. On the contrary, we really do believe that if the financial industry were to be more positive, progressive, and purposeful, it would not only be better for the customers and clients of the financial industry, it would also be better ultimately for the medium to long-term profitability and sustainability and commercial success of the organizations as well. We really do believe there's potential for a win-win there. Our topic tonight, as you know, is private equity. The event's been inspired by the book. These are the Plunderers, Gretchen and Joshua's book. The reason that book is so relevant to us is because, speaking very frankly, there are many different types of free market systems and many different types of capitalism, many different flavors of capitalism, if you like. And what we are seeing in the UK and internationally is a type of capitalism that is self-serving of the few, where organizations are not behaving in a responsible way, where the people who are controlling those firms sometimes, maybe more than sometimes, put short-term financial interest and gain above all else. And that's a problem. It's a problem that manifests itself in many, many different ways. It may well be that Joshua and Gretchen talk, for example, in the UK's experience about water companies that have been polluting the seas and the rivers. And maybe some of that's to do with commercial pressures that they create for themselves as a consequence of this aggressive and short-termist form or flavor of capitalism that really isn't good for people or planet. We have a lovely, small, cozy group here today. Can everybody please take an opportunity to very, very, very briefly introduce yourself? So who you are, where you are, and why the topic of conduct in the private equity space is of interest to you, and somehow squeeze that into about 20 seconds. And I do mean that, about 20 seconds. We're going to go in this order. We'll go into groups of 2 or 3. Jim Bignell, then Martin Allen, then Ian Tyler. So Jim, Martin, Ian. Mr. Bignell, as succinct as you can possibly make it, who you are, where you are, and why this topic of private equity is of interest to you, sir. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Jim Bignell. I'm the founder of the Responsible Business Project 2030. I think we're interested in all sectors in business and trying to make them more responsible towards people and planet issues, as well as making it an ethical profit. Thank you. And 20 seconds, Andy.
That was great. You're somewhere in the UK. I forget where, though. Where is it?
Well, I'm not actually. I'm in France at the moment.
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure.
But normally Walgrave in Berkshire.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much. Mr. Martin Allen, you're next, sir. As succinct as you can possibly make it. Thanks, Martin.
Sure, I'll keep it succinct. Hi, yeah, I'm from South London. I'm a retired social worker. I haven't read the book. I wish I had, but I'm interested in this in the subject matter, and there's some overlap with some of my activism with Global Justice Now, which about, as you'll be aware, I'm sure private banks are very ruthless in how they manage the debts with some very poor countries across the globe, and haven't, backed off when even during, crises like COVID. So yeah, I'm interested to hear more from somebody who's knows a lot more about it than I do. Thanks.
Martin, thank you very much. Did you mention where you were? Forgive me if you did, I didn't hear.
South London.
South London, you did at the very beginning. That's right. Okay, we're going to go to Ian Tyler, then Chris Toby, and then Joe Killeran. Nice to see you, Joe. Mr. Tyler, go for it. Thank you.
Ian Tyler. I live just to the north of London, just in Hertfordshire. I guess I'm probably on this evening because I've seen quite a lot of private equity transactions, and that one of the things that concerns me greatly is whilst the people involved in the transactions may be based in their London offices, invariably the funds that they represent are located in Luxembourg. So essentially all the money all the profits end up being routed to Luxembourg, and there's no tax going to the UK exchequer anymore and things. So that's part of that concerns me a great deal. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ian. And for those that don't know Ian, Ian has a very senior banking background. Thanks very much, Ian. Chris, please introduce yourself. Chris Toby, thank you.
Yeah, my name is Chris Toby. I'm from Kentucky. I'm one of the U.S. people. I've been working with Gretchen Morgenson for 15 years. She is probably one of the leaders in mainstream media in the U.S. on transparency issues around other things. So she's great at that. And her book is great. I learned a lot about non-transparent asset classes like private equity. You combine it with another non-transparent asset class, life insurance, and you get a toxic mix. So as the lack of transparency drives everything in the book, and it's very, very important, and very relevant globally.
Thank you, Chris. Lovely to have you with us, and brilliant to have you here. So let's go to Graham Hadley. After Graham, we're going to go to Nick Rogers, then Steve Hubbard. So Graham, then Nick Rogers, then Steve Hubbard. Graham.
Thank you. Graham Headley, freelance chartered secretary, wild tracklands of the London-Surrey borders. Shareholdings are my business, so I need to find out more about them. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Headley. Mr. Nick Rogers, please take yourself off mute and say hello.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Hi, Andy. Well, I really haven't got much to say as usual, but I'm pleased to be a member of the TTF, and I'm delighted for everybody's attendance, and thanks to Andy for putting this all together. So I'll just keep it short. Nobody wants to hear from me, so let's get on with the others. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Nick. Before you go, where are you? Where are you?
In Devon.
In Devon. Okay, you're not the only one. Mr. Steve Hubbard, you're next, then Jacina, then Nigel Cairns is also in Devon. Steve.
Right. My name is Steve Hubbard. I'm in East Anglia in Great Britain, and my interest really as an amateur is in financial systems. I thought it would be just one financial system that everyone worked to, but it seems there are alternatives, and for private equity comes into it, so that's one of the alternative systems. So that's where my interest is tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Jacina, all the way in Brussels. Go for it, Jacina.
Thanks a lot, Andy, and lovely to be here tonight. I'm Jacina Kamerling. I work for CFA Institute, and my task is to do regulatory outreach in the EMEA region, which means actually focusing on business conduct, market transparency, integrity, and investor protection issues. Business conduct is really at the forefront of my interest, as is ethics. I do a lot on the sideline besides my day job, working amongst others with the Vatican on these kind of issues. And 2 days ago, I was teaching at IOSCO, the International Organization of Securities Regulators, on ethics and business conduct. So very topical, all of it.
I think I'm safe to say that it's an official statement. Jacina definitely, literally has God on her side. It's no doubt about it. Thanks, Jacina. Thank you. We're going to go to Nigel Cairns, then Jim Hofheimer. Jim, lovely to see you, by the way. It's been a while. Nigel.
Yeah, Nigel Cairns from Devon, actually East Devon. Devon's a massive county, so I don't know where Nick is. I'm a victim of bank malfeasance. So I've got no particular interest in private equity, other than I've learned that everything in finance is closely interconnected. And there's always something interesting to learn on any TTF symposium. So I'm here.
You're very kind to say that, and interesting how you wanted to distinguish that you're in East Devon. So that's very good. Thanks, Nigel. Jim, nice to see you, sir. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Andy. I'm Jim Hofheimer. I'm in Asheville, North Carolina.
I've been following and enjoying Gretchen's work longer than she wants me to admit, all the way back to the New York Times. I am run a wealth management practice nationally, who unfortunately just took on, much to my dismay, private equity money. And it's very appropriate for this group because I find private equity to be the direct opposite of transparency. And, well, I'll leave it to the authors to talk further about it, but it's a wonderful book. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Wonderful. We're going to go to Mr. Con Keating next. By the way, for those of you that don't know, if it wasn't for Con, it's highly unlikely that the Transparency Task Force would even exist. After Con, we're going to go to Robert Delner, and then we'll wrap up the loose ends, and then we'll be going to Joshua and Gretchen. Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Andy. For my sins in helping to create the TTF, I will probably spend eternity in hell. Though I am a retired financial analyst, otherwise known as a has-been bond trader. Interest specifically in private equity at the moment is actually more general. My interest is in private investments. They are flavor of the month with all sorts of talk of regulatory interventions to require such investments by UK pension funds. And I think that currently we have an enormous problem with the valuation of the existing stock of private investments. Leave it there.
That's perfect, Con. Thank you very much. Robert Delner, a great supporter of TTF. He has read all those books behind him, by the way, and he's probably written a few of them too. Mr. Delner.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, I'm just south of London, near Guildford in Surrey, and also a former investment banker, actually a former colleague of the Honourable Mr. Con Keating, who just spoke. So my interest these days is I work on deep impact investments and also a professor of economics and finance at university in the US, and also working with a Catholic university in Italy called Sofia, connected to the Vatican as it happens as well. Particularly interested in private equity in terms of what's the next story. You may recall Barbarians at the Gate. I'm just penning a title of a new book called Psychopaths at the Gate, which is kind of playing on the same theme. The idea being, what's the next story for private equity? What are they trying to arbitrage next, being very much in the arbitrage business? So is there a future for private equity in the world, which we are kind of emerging slowly but painfully into, where there is more transparently, supposedly, etc. So I'm just curious to see what's the state of play and where private equity goes from here. Thank you.
Robert, thank you very much indeed. Joe, let's give it another go. Can you say hello to me?
I'll be short and sweet. Gretchen is incredible. I did teach a term at Wilfrid Laurier University in 2002, sabbatical coverage, and I wish I'd met her father, who was teaching psychology there then. And I've been communicating with Gretchen probably for 10 years. And she did a column in 2017 in July about IFRS accounting, which Canada has adopted versus US GAAP. And our Canada pension plan is 48% private equity invested. This is retirement savings for all Canadians. And most of it, private equity, is IFRS accounting. And IFRS is full of trickeries, chicaneries in accounting, which Gretchen's aware of. She's written about it. And hopefully someday Gretchen can get the SEC to do a comparison between US GAAP accounting and IFRS accounting, International Financial Reporting Standards. And because 140 countries around the world have adopted IFRS accounting, why is the US keeping US GAAP? And get the SEC to expose IFRS accounting, using, of course, Canada, its next door neighbor, and what's happening with us here in this country. But we're 48%, our pension plan is invested in private equities.
Very interesting stuff, Joe. Thank you so much. Well, we have a truly international group here. Folks, in a moment, I'm going to be asking you to put your hands together and applaud for two reasons. First of all, thank you all so much for wanting to be part of this little gathering today. So great that you're all here. Please applaud yourselves for that. But of course, also please applaud the fact that we have Joshua and Gretchen who've given up some time to talk about their thoughts as expressed in their book. So here we go. Our first round of applause. I'm sure it won't be the last. And I think we're going to go to Gretchen now. Gretchen and then to Joshua. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Andy, and we're thrilled to be here today. And I love my fan club. My gosh, I'm so lucky, so lucky. Thank you all for coming. So when Josh and I set out to write this book, These Are the Plunderers, we knew we'd be obviously exploring complicated financial deals, Byzantine corporate structures, and secretive practices. But we also recognized that it was even more important to identify the many people who are harmed, who are hurt by these transactions. And those people are workers, customers, pensioners, and even taxpayers who end up paying for these activities that really wind up enriching a tiny elite group of people. So we all know very well who those elite few are, the handful of men who are billionaires many times over, and they are among the most celebrated business people of our time. Henry Kravis of KKR, Steve Schwarzman of the Blackstone Group, David Rubenstein of the Carlyle Group, and Leon Black, founder of Apollo. They are the boldest of the financial world's bold-faced names, and in America, they are ubiquitous. They're extolled for their financial acumen, charitable contributions, and art collections. They sit on prestigious museum boards and hold sway in the halls of Washington. Calculations of their net worths appear annually, and breathless news stories applaud them. This applause echoes around them even as they profit from perhaps the most predatory form of capitalism we're experiencing, an industry where a small group of money men win and almost everyone else loses. So those are the winners of this game known as private equity. Less well known are the people on the other side of the table. The losers, if you will, the folks who have been damaged by private equity's business practices over the years. While their stories are crucial to understanding the pernicious impact the industry is having on our society, these people rarely receive coverage from financial reporters. They pay the price of private equity's power grab across America and the world, and their pain is real. As casualties of the industry, they are growing in number every year. And so in our book, you'll meet some of these people. We felt it was important that those stories be told. Katie Watson is an example. She was a disabled toddler whose parents won a malpractice award from an Arizona hospital, and her care was supposed to be covered by an insurance policy for as long as she lived. After an institution affiliated with Apollo took over her insurance, though, Katie wound up receiving a fraction of what she was owed. Her parents lost their home paying for her care, but the Apollo partners made billions of dollars. Katie was just one of thousands who received far less than they were owed as policyholders. Consider, too, the primary school children in New Madrid, Missouri, a small town in the state's economically challenged Boot Heel or southeastern region. These children went without books, and their teachers had to pay for their own health insurance after Apollo bankrupted the town's largest employer, an aluminum smelter responsible for 1/3 of the school district's revenues. Apollo, meanwhile, made 3 times its investment in the smelter, bleeding it dry over several years and leaving 2,500 people jobless in the region. Then there are the 20,000 nursing home residents whose lives were lost over a decade in facilities owned by private equity, according to an academic study from 2021. Private equity-owned nursing homes had 10% greater death rates than nursing facilities owned by other for-profit companies and nonprofits, the study found. And the academics attributed these horrifying outcomes to inferior care, lower staffing ratios, and cost cutting. Eddie Martinez, who lost his mother to COVID in a private equity home nursing home in California, is another character in our book. He told me the nursing home managers he dealt with cared more about profits than residents. Now, fawning financial reporters who cover the billionaire class don't write about Eddie, Katie, or small town Missouri school teachers and school children. In These Are the Plunderers, though, we track private equity's record over the past 30 plus years so that you can hear from others who lost out to the financiers. Mark Cannon, for example, is a Samsonite salesman who was laid off when the company was savaged by private equity in the 1990s. You'll also meet Ray Brovant, an emergency department doctor who was fired by a private equity-backed staffing company after he demanded changes that would have made his hospital safer for patients. You'll hear from Slato, a land defender and matriarch of the Gidimt'en clan of the Wet'suwet'en tribe, a First Nations people in Canada who are fighting a fracking gas pipeline funded by private equity that has already damaged her ancestral lands. And Christine Ribick, a courageous whistleblower who was terminated by her private equity-owned nursing home company when she flagged unspeakable patient abuse. Ribick was victimized twice for trying to protect patients. Once when she was fired, and again when the United States Department of Justice dropped its $700 million Medicare fraud case against the company in 2017, letting it off the hook. No one would hire Ribick after her role as whistleblower came out. She told me I felt like killing myself. She could not find a job, and only recently has she begun to be able to talk about her experience. These people's stories are central to understanding private equity and what it is doing to our world. A newish name for what used to be called leveraged buyout shops or corporate raiders, these firms buy companies, load them with debt to pay for the acquisitions, and then hope to sell them at a profit in 5 years or so. But because the debt used to buy the companies is onerous and costly, the companies often struggle after the purchases. Costs must be cut to meet the debt burdens, and that usually translates into employee layoffs, slashed benefits and healthcare coverage, diminished product quality, and higher costs. And in nursing homes, more deaths. Not surprisingly, heavily leveraged companies owned by private equity go bankrupt at a rate 10 times that of companies not owned by private equity, academic research shows. Private equity-backed companies increase costs for consumers, especially among the healthcare industry, and taxpayers wind up paying when private equity bankrupts companies, depleting local tax rolls. To top it off, private equity investments no longer generate higher returns than a low-cost S&P 500 index fund. So the pensioners whose underfunded pensions buy into the private equity myth are hurt as well. Over the past 3 decades, private equity has quite literally taken over our world in America. That coffee and donut I picked up on my way to work this morning, the pre-K learning center where my colleague dropped off his children, and the nursing home where my aunt lives, the dermatologist's office, the emergency department at the local hospital, and the ambulance that rushes people there, My favorite podcast, pet care provider, rental home or apartment, all owned and overseen by private equity firms that maximize for profits and a quick sale in a few years. Because they operate in secrecy, the wreckage that private equity leaves behind is often difficult to trace back to its origins. But it is entirely likely that you buy goods and services from private equity-owned companies every day without knowing it. Here are some figures about how pervasive private equity has become in the US. An astonishing 40% of emergency departments are run by private equity companies. An estimated 11% of nursing homes are owned by private equity, a percentage that is probably low because of hidden, non-transparent ownership. As for the American labor force, some 7% works for private equity-backed companies. Private equity is less dominant in Europe, but they are definitely coming for you. The UK water system, which Andy mentioned earlier, is under siege to the plunderers, and that's just one example. As The Guardian so ably reported, these privateers have brought with them a predictable underinvestment that has led to sewage pollution, water shortages, and leaks across your country. Now, to hear the private equity firms tell it, they create jobs and enhance capitalism. According to a Blackstone spokesman that I worked with, the argument that private equity contributes to the widening wealth gap in this country is a mischaracterization. He called it an 80s era caricature. In fact, Blackstone said over the past 15 years, it has created 200,000 net new jobs at the portfolio companies it owns. And the rate at which Blackstone's portfolio companies file for bankruptcy, the spokesman said, is a tiny fraction of the average found in academic research. Wow, I said, 200,000 jobs, that's an impressive claim. So I asked Blackstone's spokesman to provide the data behind the figures, both the stellar job creation numbers and the bankruptcies. A few days later, I received his answer. The firm respectfully declined to provide the backing for the claim. We are just supposed to believe what they say. As we are to believe that Blackstone's extensive monitoring and management oversight of the companies it owns somehow failed to uncover the fact that a slaughterhouse cleaning operation among its holdings was employing over 100 children in facilities across the country. Recently, the US television show 60 Minutes ran a segment on this company, known as PSSI, following a series of stories on NBC News about the scandal. Blackstone and PSSI both say they didn't know children were being hired to clean the slaughterhouses. Given that 3 Blackstone executives sat on PSSI's board, this strains credulity. Now, much has been written about the widening gulf between rich and poor in the US and how our style of capitalism has failed to provide a living wage for so many. But less is known about the crucial role this small cohort of elite financiers has played in this outcome over the past 30 years. These Are the Plunderers is about a group of men whose unrelenting pursuit of profits extracts wealth from the many to enrich the few. But it is also about their enablers, because the privateers' billions shield them from criticism, allowing them to spend fortunes on lobbying and other tactics to manipulate outcomes and public opinion. The marauders answer to almost no one. Workers, investors, pensioners, and taxpayers all should be trying to take the economy back from the plunderers. Their heads they win, tails we lose approach to business is unsustainable. And if it's allowed to continue, the prosperity that can be achieved by the many will continue to disappear into the pockets of just a few. Now I'd like to hand it over to Josh to talk a little bit more about those enablers.
Thank you, Gretchen, and thank you for having me here. So I think it's worth stepping back a little bit to the where we are in the cycle. What is the cycle? What is the business model? Because the book really opens with a deep dive into the 1980s barbarians, who the junk bond kings who loaded up companies with debt by taking them over, sold the obligations to pension funds and insurance companies, and ultimately led to the failures of those insurance companies. Because I think the cycle is coming full circle. But at that time, largely, private equity was a valuation arbitrage between the public market value of a company and the private market value of a company. So they would take over an underperforming public company. They would try and increase the efficiencies with the goal of selling it back into the market in an IPO 5 to 7 years later and reap the benefits. It ended up going really from that to taking over businesses to increase the so-called efficiencies, cutting headcount, cutting costs, improving margins. And then later in the cycle, it became about strip mining. Take over a company, load it with debt, dividend your self-equity as quickly as you can out of the corpse of the company, and really leave the carcass if that's what it was going to be your best exit, or sell it to someone else or IPO it, less likely. Now we're very late cycle, and there's fewer and fewer targets for them to go after. And so private equity has, over the past 10 to 15 years, really started focusing their efforts on industries that we would all recognize should not, and historically would not, have been run exclusively for profits. Industries that do have a social value, a social purpose. Utilities such as water and gas, education, healthcare. These are industries that are supposed to be run as much for the public good as for the possibility of returns to investors who support them. Private equity, by buying these, really fostered and exacerbated the crisis in the United States in the healthcare by cutting costs, by cutting headcount, by cutting beds, by cutting staffing, by cutting ventilators, by cutting stocks of inventory of masks and other key equipment. And that's sort of where we are. That was the genesis of Gretchen and I starting to talk about the need for a bright light to be shown here. But the harms, as Gretchen said, really extend well beyond the employees and the companies. And unfortunately, they also expose a whole other class of enablers, because the money that the private equity firms get to invest, raise to invest, is typically from pension funds, endowment funds, insurance companies. And that's really, at this point, one of the key concerns here, because pension funds who have an obligation to future retirees and current pensioners really have an obligation to make sure that when these people retire, the money's available to meet the obligations to them. And that means that the pension manager is a fiduciary, and they should have the interest in investing the money so that it both grows to meet those obligations and is liquid, readily available as cash on hand at the time that those obligations are due. But the assumed returns that pension funds claim do not often match reality. In fact, one only need to look at the annual statements of the endowment funds, of the pension funds, of the insurance companies, to see that the assumed returns on private equity and other illiquid investments are usually overstated and don't take into account the fees or the ultimate actual returns. In fact, in aggregate, as Gretchen pointed out, the returns of private equity are closer to investing in a readily liquid stock index fund. So why would you invest it? And in fact, there are major Ivy League institutions today who have 75% of their endowments invested in illiquid assets like private equity rather than readily liquid assets like securities? And the answer is there's a hand in glove issue here. Private equity has an interest in making sure that the returns look wonderful, but why do the pension managers have an interest? Well, while the PE fund managers don't get paid out until they sell or realize the returns on an investment, the pension managers usually get paid on the net asset value of the funds that they manage. In liquid assets like stocks, the actual value is readily available. Just look at the current price of a stock or a bond. But in illiquid assets like private equity, the net asset value is tied to the assumptions of the value, mark to model rather than mark to market. And that leaves a lot of room for the PE firms to overstate the current value of their investments, which not only helps boost the claim returns and allow them to market and bring in more money, but it helps the pension managers to get paid more because they're getting paid on that current believed, assumed, sometimes make-believe value rather than a real market value. So how big is the problem? As I said, between 50 and 75% of many, if not most, pension, endowment, and insurance firms' assets are in illiquid assets today rather than in readily available liquid assets that are marked to market. And that's fine when times are good. But as example, when you have an economic crisis and the real estate values fall and the actual value of these liquid assets are forced to be marked to market to come up with cash on hand, you start seeing the large embedded losses, the underfunding of pension plans and endowment funds, and the economic stress that that causes on the ultimate recipients of those funds. And that means that just at the time that they have assumed to have the liquid cash, the money's not there. And right now we're at an especially troubling time in a cycle because with the US Federal Reserve have essentially doubling the money supply during the COVID years and now withdrawing liquidity, we're starting to see those real market values fall, which means that embedded losses are so far unrealized, but they will not be unrealized for long. And this isn't just theory, this is cycle. The book begins with a large insurance company, as I said, that loaded up on investments in illiquid junk bonds during the Drexel Burnham days. And when it failed, it ended up causing the losses to people who needed those monies to survive. At this point, we're watching over the past 5 years, these same private equity firms start buying insurance companies. And they're buying insurance companies both as an outlet in which to sell their investments into, as co-investors in the investments, and as a way to take over other pension obligations, convert them to annuities, market the annuities, and back the long-dated obligations with their short-term, high-yielding, high-risk assets, creating the risk of a very significant future systemic crisis. So with that, thank you again for having us. And we look forward to engaging in this conversation and hope that the conversation doesn't end here.
Joshua, Gretchen, thank you both very much indeed from all of us. So please, folks, let's show our appreciation for our speakers tonight. Thank you very, very much indeed. In a moment, we're going to be going to Con Keating and then to Jacina. I think Con may well come back to the point about the assumptions of net value, and perhaps Jacina will talk about the, if you like, the ethics and integrity dimension to this. But if I could please put a question to our speakers first of all. We've talked about the problem side of the equation. Do you have a feel for how this could be solved? Is it solvable? You know, is this an issue that's actually got a way of being solved, or perhaps scarily, maybe the cat's out of the bag? Maybe this is an unstoppable train heading towards some kind of horrific disaster, or could, for example, some regulatory interventions start to change things around. So could you speak to that point, Joshua, Gretchen? Is this a problem that's solvable in some way? And if so, what might some kind of solution look like? Any thoughts on that, please? Then we'll go to Jacina. Thank you.
Well, Josh,
So-
I think you're in the Washington realm a lot more than I.
Yep.
So, maybe talk a little bit about some of the ideas that have been launched, but of course that have been absolutely stymied by the lobbying power of these firms.
Yeah, and I should start by saying, I think that the way you posited the question, are there solutions or are we heading to an ultimate crisis? I don't think that those are mutually exclusive. I think that they can be, but I don't see any will. And I think that's part of the point that Gretchen is talking about. First of all, it used to be that the exit from a private equity investment was typically you buy a company, you take it over, you improve the business, and you move it towards a better valuation, re-IPO it, and there's your exit. Okay. And that's when you crystallize the gain. It's increasingly become a game of trading, baseball cards, where one firm will find their exit in selling the same business to either a different fund within their same complex of funds, or sell it to another competing private equity firm. And so that actually perpetuates the valuation myth. And it does so in a way that can be easily solved. Requirements of, third arm's length transactions, requirements of third-party validation, evaluation, requirements of regular third-party valuation of current value rather than allowing this mark-to-model approach to be so pervasive. But we're not really seeing a will to do that. And therein lies a big piece of the problem. So I don't really see a lot of effort to rein in those aspects. There's transparency aspects as well that can be addressed. Frankly, Gretchen had done an amazing job of finding that in the US, in most states, it's illegal for a corporation to own a health business. And there's a reason for that, right? Historically, these were businesses that were professions, and they were professions that served a public good, and they were intended to put the patient first and foremost above profit. And so there's long been this history of separating the corporate ownership from the medical industry. Gretchen was able to find that in one case, there was a doctor who ran 300 different physician groups around the country, which rolled up ultimately to ownership by private equity. And so there could be disclosure requirements on who is the ultimate owner of all of these companies. There could be look-through liability. So as we just talked about, when there were over 100 children as young as 14 working the night shift to clean slaughterhouses in the United States, the company that owned it was a private equity owned company, but because it was a separate company, the liability remained at the company, not with the private equity firm. And so there could be look through and ultimate obligations, like we do in banking, where the ultimate ownership has to be a source of strength to the underlying business. We haven't really begun to engage in discussions about this, largely because of the power of the lobbying.
The other thing that is important to know is that the Department of Justice and the FTC could definitely start to rein in some of these acquisitions. And there is some, talk of that under the Biden administration. Previously, you would have these smallish acquisitions that wouldn't even get on the radar screen of the antitrust enforcers in the country. They weren't large enough. They didn't seem to be problematic. But when you think of them in terms of as being part of a bigger roll-up by a private equity firm, then it does have the same kind of antitrust element and threat to consumers that a monopolistic entity would have. So you can certainly have more enforcement along the lines of the FTC or the DOJ. And as Josh points out, if you had the DOJ going after some of these firms in healthcare, for example, for Medicare fraud, if they're owned by private equity, why not go up to the parent instead of just, penalizing or pursuing the portfolio company? Because the portfolio companies are only doing what they've been basically instructed to do, which is to cut costs, increase profits, and if it means conducting themselves with Medicare fraud, so be it.
And if it means that they ultimately fail, so be it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Fantastic. Gretchen, Joshua, thank you very much. We're going to go to Con, then to Jacina. Now, Gretchen and Josh need to be out of here by 7 p.m. UK time, which is in about 10 minutes or so. We can carry on chatting afterwards for those that may want to. I'm very happy to do that. But now let's go to Con. Thank you, Con.
Thanks. I should begin with a statement of interest. I've actually known Mike Milken since the mid-1970s. For a period there, we traveled in to Wall Street on the same bus. Yeah, he was once as poor as the rest of us. My concerns here are manifold. There's little doubt that there are many wrongs taking place here. But my interests make me wonder, first and foremost, about valuation. It seems to me that there is probably a very strong case for requiring valuations of private equity investments to be conducted independently of the private equity managers and their associates. I also think that in trying to pursue liability up an ownership trail, when you are talking about a limited liability structure, is probably a mistake. It's not to say that one shouldn't go up, but the way in which one goes up is by pursuing the individuals involved, the directors. With the sort of wrongs that are taking place, the directors' liabilities are personal. And that is, I think, the way to remedy some of the worst of these excesses. There was talk earlier on about accounting standards. I think one of the funniest documents I've ever read is IPEV, the valuation standards. 160 odd pages of accounting standards, which can only be regarded as a universal get out of jail free card. In fact, not so much a get out of jail free card. It's a get out of jail and get paid lots of money for it card. The valuation standards, frankly, are not worth toffee. Those are my comments and thoughts.
Con, thank you very much. I've just put into the chat one of many articles written quite recently about this idea that there needs to be personal jeopardy for the people responsible, the individuals. This is about the water company situation in the UK. It really just backs up the point that Con just made. And that's very interesting. That's very interesting indeed. Con, thank you very much indeed. Jacina, to you, please, your thoughts.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you very much to Gretchen and Joshua. I will certainly read the book. And as you were speaking, Gretchen, I was reminded of about 15 years ago when I was working in the European Parliament, and Polish MEP Danuta Hübner actually asked me to write a paper about private equity and its effect on SMEs in Europe. So it's not new. It's been on the radar of people who care actually in politics, I would say, because of course we have to see that there are quite a few people in politics that don't care. But I would give you the following thoughts. Of course, I'm working a lot on ethics and business conduct. And in fact, 2 days ago, I was speaking to 100+ regulators in Madrid at the IOSCO training. And it was really interesting because regulators are challenged by continued misbehavior, by a capitalist system which is just not working for, as we say, the good of society or the economy even. And so what to do? Where do you go? Put into that some of the very interesting surveys that have come out of the Edelman Trust. The latest one that I take to heart, not the 2022, but the 2021, if you want to look it up, highlighted the fact that people are increasingly no longer looking to institutions, whether it's governments, any kind of institution to get an action, a movement. They're looking to companies. So that's a dual-edged sword, isn't it? Because in a way, companies that are being bought by PE groups, they're supposed to act in the best interest. They're supposed to take into account stakeholders, but they're in fact being unarmed. And so you have a system that is just going round on its axis with nobody being able to come in and intervene. So here's what there is an awareness of this, and there is a group called North Star Transition, which is, and you, Andy, know it, you participate in some of its meetings, that is trying to think of how to change the financial system, because I'm afraid the way we're going, even with the whole sustainability story, we're not able. You know, there is a short-term look in anybody. The blinders are up, whether it's in politicians, whether it's in governments, regulators, financial industry. Everybody has a blind on. And this is frankly, you know, not just going to help. It's about this profitability. And as I think it was Joshua that was mentioning the systemic crisis that is to come. Well, yes, I mean, that's absolutely true. And Jean-Claude Trichet, who's working with us in our Systemic Risk Council, is continually warning about this. So I have no immediate solutions like all of you, but what I am saying is that there is an increasing awareness that there has to be a fundamental change. And actually, I will remind people of a survey we did together at CFA Institute with the Economist Intelligence Unit back in 2013, when we interviewed the then head of the HR Association of HR Professionals in the City of London. And he said, actually, if you want to change the financial industry, you need to rewire and recruit a completely different type of profile.
Justina, thank you very much indeed. That last point you made is especially interesting. This idea that there needs to be like a cultural transfusion, a different type of person in these positions of power and influence. I think I'm right in saying that somebody did some research once that the profile, this is an extreme point, the profile of many bankers matches that of psychopaths. You know, they have the same kind of predatory, aggressive, competitive mindsets. So maybe this is a cultural thing. I'm going to go back to Josh and Gretchen just for some final thoughts before they need to disappear. Go on, Josh. Please do.
You know, I think part of it isn't even the personality per se of the population in the industry. I think it's that we've created a system where the arbitrage opportunities are so embedded and so clear and so available, and the ability to trade off of asymmetric information and asymmetries in the system so that we don't have the transparency where everyone knows who owns what when. That's the value proposition. And if we close the loopholes of our 100-plus-year-old plumbing, I think that in itself would go a long way to modifying behaviors and fixing some of the systemic concerns.
Joshua, thank you. Joshua, could I stay with you? Do you have any final additional thoughts before I go to Gretchen for the same point? Because I know you guys need to go quite shortly. For those that want to stay, please do. We can carry on nattering about this for a while. Josh, any final further comments from yourself?
Look, my final comment is this has been wonderful to be included and invited to be part of this. And you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to continue the discussion. I'm happy to work with any of you towards working on these issues. So thank you again.
Thank you, Josh. You'll be most welcome to continue engaging with us. We'd be delighted with that. And Gretchen, any final comments from yourself? Thank you.
Well, ditto for me. I am also very available and can be located on NBCnews.com website. My email is there at the bottom of all my stories. But I would love to say that, Josina, I'm very, very thrilled to hear that this is a topic of concern and discussion at the highest levels of these various governments and regulatory agencies, because I just don't get the sense that that is the case in the United States. And so once again, Europe may be far ahead of us, but I certainly hope that that translates into a little bit of action, or at least opening up of discussions about this problem and these problems in the US. So I'm encouraged to hear that. I only hope that we can see it over on this side of the pond.
Gretchen, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. So let's put our hands together to thank once again Josh and Gretchen. They've got to get going, but we can stay for those that want to carry on chatting for a while. And I know that Mr. Ian Tyler has got something he'd like to say. So Ian, to you, sir. Thank you.
I wonder if they could just answer one quick question. I think Joshua might know the answer. Do you have the same issue in the United States as we have here, where basically a lot of the funds are put into an offshore jurisdiction, which is incredibly low tax, and then they use with financial engineering, they use intra-company debt to get all the profits offshore and effectively don't pay tax anywhere. Do they use the same?
100% and almost 100% of the time.
Okay, yeah, exactly. I mean, I've seen every takeover I've seen with private equity has got incredibly complex legal structures. They always, in UK terms, they always end up in Luxembourg. So because Luxembourg is the easiest jurisdiction within this time zone to use. So it's fascinating.
Here it's often Cayman Islands.
Well, I thought you were going to say the Cayman Islands.
And you know, it's funny because if you or I or an individual engaged in any activities that looked anything like these, we would be in jail for tax evasion.
We would. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, thank you. That was all I really wanted to ask, Andy. Sorry.
Ian, thank you again. Thanks again. Cheers, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andy.
Thank you. I'm going to pick on a couple of you because I'd be really keen to get your thoughts. I'm going to go to Jim Bignell because Jim runs a kind of responsible business movement, and I'm springing this on him. He wasn't expecting it, but so Jim, there you are building this momentum around responsible businesses and businesses doing good. You know, a whole kind of business for good agenda. What are your thoughts coming at things from the other end of the telescope, as it were? Somebody who's hardwired into business for good. What are your thoughts about the state of private equity and what could and should be done to fix it?
Thanks, Andy. I'm not an expert on private equity. I know very little about it. And thank you to those two guys for explaining a little bit about the malfeasance going on. I suppose our objective is much broader, including all the sectors. And I think what we would like to do is to encourage employees, people who work for these organisations, to take action against any unethical behaviour or illegal behaviour. My only feeling is that maybe in this particular sector, there are a relatively small number of employees involved with them, and they're probably all in it together. So probably that approach wouldn't work. But I think in the financial services industry, per se, which has many hundreds of thousands of people working for it, there are many people there who don't like what's going on within their sector. But whether that can, and what we're trying to do is to encourage them to take action. I'm not sure that can be done to private equity because they're probably all in it together.
Jim, thank you very much indeed. I would love to get the thoughts of Robert Delner in a moment, then Joe in Canada, and then, of course, anybody else that would like to chip in. Robert, so you're very focused on impact investing, capital being used for good. You have a similar mindset to Jim Bignell in that sense. What are your thoughts, Robert? What could potentially be done to rein in the aggressive, egregious conduct that sometimes pervades private equity? Any thoughts, Robert?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. I mean, I think the interesting thing for me was to hear that and kind of confirming a lot of my thoughts actually in terms of what arbitrages are still kind of prevalent in the market and the types of individuals that we're sort of dealing with. I mean, I look quite deeply into organizational culture, particularly within the finance industry and investment banking specifically. And it became quite clear to me in that journey that individuals and organizations were unable, unwilling, and it was not possible to have a dialogue around a positive change around organizational culture. So I agree with the notion that this is probably now some form of a reset, and new individuals need to come in. I just don't see it coming necessarily from a regulatory perspective, nor from a judicial perspective necessarily, certainly not quickly, maybe slowly. You could start to see some changes. Unfortunately, private equity is now embedded into pension funds and to other financial institutions who rely on the so-called returns, as they are accounted for their well-being, supposedly. So, I mean, at the moment, I'm a little bit it's a bit of a circular issue, I think, right now. I don't see any way out necessarily, apart from that, in time, clearly with valuations and exits having to happen, those valuations and exits will have to kind of start to come together eventually, and light will get onto what real values have been created here or not. I mean, but we have the same issue here in the UK. I mean, I go to a dentist here in my little sunny side of Woking, and it just happens that it's owned by private equity, and I'm been thinking about shifting to another dentist purely because actually I just don't trust the decision-making process with someone who has supposedly my care and attention at the forefront of their thinking, and not financial return or what their equity owners would want them to do. So I fully understand the prevalence of it. I don't think there's any easy answers, certainly not at the level of private equity itself. I think it's unreformable in that sense. So I think it's moving or pushing jurisdiction, pushing regulation more towards transparency around accounting and the other ideas that came out earlier in terms of disclosure in particular, and ownership and taxation and so forth.
Robert, thank you very much for sharing those thoughts. It's interesting that you're actually thinking about switching your dentist because you see the risk of the practice making decisions for its benefit rather than yours. That's really interesting. Thank you. Joe in Canada, please share with us your thoughts, Joe. Thank you.
Private equity, it's the valuation of the private equity. And are the valuators, say, of some of the assets, commercial office buildings, for example, is it the same valuator year after year after year, or are they switching valuators every year? And is the valuation of that building with a 40% vacancy rate or 50% vacancy rate? And we're starting to see, for example, examples of sales, you might call them fire sales, of some of these office buildings. And private equity doesn't tend to match a market valued stock price. It's got the plug figure. And if pension plans have a lot of private equity with plug figures for their valuations, then they're going to show a fully funded pension plan or with excess in the pension plan, but really they're underwater. And as we're seeing with these office buildings, when you've got to sell something, it's liquidity. Gretchen mentioned liquidity. And how liquid is it? The S&P index fund is a lot more liquid than some of these private equity things. And I've seen financial statements where the private equity isn't necessarily identified. It has this funny name to it, alternative investment in a pension plan. And you don't know what it is. And you can't even gauge if it's an office building or if it's this or that or a share of Heathrow Airport. It's called an alternative investment. So we're looking at transparencies here. And there's a little phrase, democracy dies behind closed doors. And closed doors I consider to be transparencies. And people need democracy. Democracy dies behind closed doors. And I think this is an area Judge Brandeis in the States decades ago, almost a century ago, sunshine's the greatest disinfectant. And we're not seeing enough of that in private equity. People don't know who are invested or the pension plans backing these private equity firms or these hedge fund managers. Do they really understand what they're doing with their money? And they're predators. They're not just plunderers, they're predators. Go hand in hand.
Wow, powerful stuff, Joe. Very, very powerful stuff. Democracy dies behind closed doors. It does make you suspicious, doesn't it? When things are opaque, when you can't see what's going on, it just automatically makes you suspicious. What's being hid? Why is it being hid? Who's hiding it? What's the agenda? It does make you suspicious. Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much.
Can I just come in on the valuation point?
Please do, Con. Please do. Thank you.
In this country, at least, and I think also in the US, the vast majority of valuations are not conducted by some external valuer. They are, in fact, the valuations supplied by the general partner, by the manager of the private equity fund. Now, the problems with that are immediate and obvious. I mean, if I can give you an example, private equity funds, which are basically property investments, that subsector of funds owned by UK pension funds, reported an average decline in value last year of 2%. British Land, which of course is the largest of the UK quoted property companies, chose to mark its portfolio down by just over 15%. Now, they both have the same properties. They are both suffering the same sets of problems, empty offices. There's an obvious non sequitur there. I don't believe it should be legal for a pension fund to invest in any asset which is valued by the manager of the asset. I think it's a serious issue.
Wow. Serious stuff. It makes me think that the entire system is full of BS, isn't it? It's packed card stuff. You can just imagine it all coming tumbling down. And just when something happens that forces reality to suddenly kick in, then everyone thinks, oh my God, it's not worth anything like what I thought it was.
You need to understand one of the reasons it all carries on is because there are so many other people who make money out of them. So
Yeah.
you know, the big four accounting firms make such a lot of money out of private equity, because every takeover, every sale, there's due diligence, there's accounting, there's tax structuring. They charge millions and millions in fees, and so there's a whole, and the lawyers, of course, are involved as well. So all the top lawyers, all the top accountants, they're all compromised by it, because so most of the experts are already bought off. So you know, it is quite a that's what makes it so hard to get these things out into the open, Andy.
So
they're not so much bought off as bought in.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Yes, fair enough. They're bought in by private. You're right. You're right.
So are we talking about that Charlie Munger quote then? You know, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. Are all the people involved aligned in some collective, informal, disconnected endeavor, but it's still loosely connected, whereby effectively they know that they're on a gravy train and they'll just carry on riding it for as long as they can get. That's hard to stop, isn't it? That's hard to stop. Folks, we'll be bringing things to close shortly. Please just raise your hand, literally or digitally, if you'd like to come in. Chris, pleased to see you want to come in. Chris, tell us, by the way, included in what you're about to say, tell everybody about the fighting and the battling that you've been doing in the USA to drag the truth to the surface. Go on, Chris, tell us.
Yeah, I've been dragging private equity and retirement pension systems for maybe 10 to 15 years. And Gretchen Morgenson has been a big ally. She's one of the few people in the mainstream press who's not bought off, to tell you the truth. So she's been a very fresh breath of fresh air. But what I'm finding, and there's a guy named David Sirota who does this political work, since Citizens United, which allowed what we call dark money into political campaigns, private equity has dumped millions and millions into funding politicians in direct corruption. And so most of the trustees and pension plans in the US are appointed by governors, they're appointed by people who have dark money, kind of secretive campaign accounts that Wall Street, primarily private equity, can make secret donations to without disclosure. So that's the main corruption there. On the endowment foundation side, these guys are big donors to university presidents. Presidents typically run foundations, and presidents are compensated. University presidents are compensated by how much donations they bring in. So these private equity guys throw tons of money at them in donations, and then the university presidents then push their agenda to get them into these portfolios. So this is much more than people not knowing what's going on. Most people on public pension boards don't want to know what's going on in private equity. They know they've been told by somebody else, the governor, whatever, the person who put them on the board, their union. They're buying off unions. They're buying off politicians, all private equity, all up and down in the U.S. And so that's just something, and I'm sure it's going on in the U.K. too. You just got to find it and expose it because it's there. There's too much money flowing around here, and everybody's getting a piece.
Chris, thank you very much. Unless anybody wants to come in on a particular point now, we'll start bringing the session to a close. It's been a very enjoyable conversation. I've certainly picked up some new thoughts and new ideas. The idea that's kind of working its way to the front of my mind is the point that Con made about, going for the individuals who are doing something wrong and could be shown to be doing something wrong. That old idea of personal accountability, private accountability, lock up the baddies, that would be a good thing. And in the UK, we can certainly start with the water companies. Their conduct's atrocious. Folks, thank you all very much indeed for participating today. It's been an enjoyable, informative session. I know that Gretchen and Josh aren't here, but let's clap them once again anyway. And see you next time, folks. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Bye all. Have a good evening or good afternoon. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.